All right, so today we are going to do a deep dive into something fascinating and maybe a little controversial.
Oh, sounds right up our alley.
Yeah, I think so. We're going to be talking about the sociosexual hierarchy, the SSH.
Okay.
And, you've probably heard of this. You've probably seen this online. Maybe you've debated it with friends.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's one of those concepts that people, they either love it or hate it.
Yeah,
A lot of
exactly.
strong feelings about it.
And what we're going to do today is, this is where it gets really interesting, is we're going to apply it to biblical figures.
Hmm.
And specifically, we're going to ask the question, was Jesus an alpha male?
Now, that's a question I haven't thought about before.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever heard anybody ask that question, so I am really curious to see what we come up with here.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about or referring to the work of Stanislas Berton.
Okay.
He's a French essayist. He really kind of went in on this whole applying the SSH with, alphas and betas and deltas and all that to the Bible.
Hmm. All right.
So before we jump into the whole Jesus as an alpha thing, let's just kind of very quickly make sure everybody's on the same page with what this SSH actually is, because it can be kind of complicated.
Right. It's not just a matter of, oh, you're this or you're that. There's nuance to it.
Okay, so give us the, crash course.
Okay, so the idea is it tries to categorize men based on their kind of social standing and how they navigate relationships. And there is this idea of a hierarchy, with the alpha being at the top. He's the leader, he's confident, he's assertive, he kind of attracts attention whether he wants to or not.
Like the stereotypical captain of the football team.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And then you have your betas, which are the solid, reliable guys. Not necessarily seeking the spotlight like the alpha, but definitely playing a supporting role, an important one.
Okay.
And then you have your deltas, who are kind of your average guys, every man.
All right.
Then there are the gammas, who are often intelligent, but maybe a little socially awkward,
Oh, okay.
maybe manipulative even. Then you have your omegas, who are kind of on the fringes of society.
Right.
And then you have your sigmas, who are the real wild cards, and they kind of operate outside of the hierarchy completely.
Okay.
And I think one of the most important things to remember about the SSH is it's just a model.
Right.
It's a way of looking at things and understanding social dynamics. It's not about putting people in boxes and saying, this is who you are. End of story.
Right. Yeah, it's not a value judgment. It's just a way to observe and analyze.
Exactly.
Okay, so now with that framework in mind, let's talk about Jesus. What did Burton see that led him to say, okay, this guy's an alpha?
Well, he points to several things. Jesus was a leader, no question. He gave orders. He didn't just suggest things.
Right.
He stayed calm under pressure. Think about the Garden of Gethsemane when he knew what was coming and he was still completely composed.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to challenge those in power, even when it put him at risk. He had charisma. People flocked to hear him speak. He had this magnetism.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, he definitely had a following. I mean, and people were drawn to him. He had a presence.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the nicknames. Jesus gave his disciples nicknames.
Oh, like Peter.
Yeah, he called Simon Peter. And Burton says this is a very alpha thing to do because it shows a certain dominance, a certain I have the power to define you.
It's interesting. He actually compares that to Donald Trump.
Yeah, he draws a parallel between Jesus giving nicknames and how Donald Trump often gives his rivals nicknames, which is a pretty interesting comparison.
Yeah, it's kind of a bold comparison to make. So are we saying that Jesus was basically the Donald Trump of his time?
Not exactly. It's more about recognizing that those same dynamics of power can play out in very different contexts.
Right.
Yeah, it's about looking for those patterns.
Okay, so how does the rest of the Bible kind of fit into this? What about the people in Jesus's inner circle?
Well, take Peter, for example. Burton classifies him as a bravo, loyal for sure, but he also had his moments of weakness, like when he denied Jesus 3 times.
Right?
Or when he impulsively cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. It shows a certain, impulsiveness, a difficulty staying steady under pressure.
That's an interesting take. So the rest of the apostles, where do they fall in this whole hierarchy?
Burton puts most of them in the Delta category. They follow orders, but they don't really take initiative until after Pentecost.
Right, like Pentecost is this huge turning point for them. It's almost like they get like a power-up or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's a major shift.
So what about the people who weren't part of that core group, who were kind of on the outside?
Well, the Gospels are full of people who were marginalized, who were outcasts in their society, and Burton sees them as fitting the Omega archetype.
Okay, interesting. And what about Judas?
Ah, Judas.
He's kind of a complex character.
Yeah, Burton actually classifies Judas as a gamma. That incident with the expensive perfume, the betrayal itself. It kind of aligns with some of those classic gamma traits.
Whoa, I never thought about Judas that way. And speaking of gammas, doesn't he also categorize the Pharisees as gammas too, those religious leaders who are always clashing with Jesus?
He does, yeah. He points to their passive aggressiveness, their attempts to manipulate situations, their use of the Roman authorities to get what they want. All of that fits his interpretation of the gamma archetype.
Hmm. Okay, so we've talked about alphas, bravos, deltas, gammas, omegas. What about the sigmas, those who are supposed to exist outside of the whole system?
That's where it gets a little tricky, even for Burton. He initially suggests that Paul might be a Sigma,
Okay.
but then he leans more towards John the Baptist. It seems that even in a biblical context, this archetype defies easy categorization.
So if even Burton's struggling to figure out where the sigma fits in, it makes you wonder, is there anybody else in the Bible who might fit this archetype? It's like a puzzle, isn't it?
It is, and it raises the question, is the model itself missing something, or are we just looking at it from the wrong angle?
That's a great question. Maybe we need to shift our perspective a bit, and that's exactly what we're going to do as we continue this deep dive. So stick with us. Things are about to get even more interesting.
It's interesting, right? Because when Burton applies this model to Jesus, he's not just trying to label him. He's really inviting us to think differently about leadership, even in a religious context.
Yeah, but I mean, if we're going to look at Jesus as like a leader through this SSH lens, doesn't it kind of raise some questions? Like, wasn't he all about, humility and serving others? I mean, those things don't really scream like alpha male, do they?
Right, that is a very important point, and it kind of highlights the fact that Jesus was a complex figure. Trying to fit him into any box, even one that's as nuanced as the SSH, is bound to raise some questions.
Okay.
And some people argue that his emphasis on compassion and forgiveness and selflessness, those things don't really line up with how we traditionally think of an alpha, with their dominance and ambition.
So could Burton be like misinterpreting certain parts of Jesus's personality to kind of fit his theory?
He could be, or maybe it's the model itself that needs a closer look. Maybe the SSH, while helpful for understanding some social dynamics, just isn't really equipped to fully grasp the complexities of someone like Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, any model that tries to categorize something as complicated as human behavior is probably going to have its limits.
For her. And while exploring Jesus through the SSH lens can be, it can be interesting and thought-provoking, we have to remember these categories. They're not airtight.
Okay, yeah.
People are complicated. They're multifaceted, and Jesus is no exception.
Right, so where does that leave us? I mean, if we can't definitively say whether Jesus was an alpha or not, what's the point of all this?
I think the value is in the questions it makes us ask. It forces us to re-examine our assumptions about leadership, about power, about what it means to be an alpha even.
Okay, I get that. But, like, how does any of this connect to, our listeners? Why should they care about analyzing Jesus through this model?
Well, it's not just about Jesus. It's about understanding human behavior, even in our own lives.
Okay.
Whether or not you agree with Burton's conclusions, his analysis makes us think critically about those qualities that we associate with leadership and how those qualities might show up in different people.
So it's about, like, recognizing these patterns, these archetypes, and then seeing how they play out in our own interactions.
Exactly, yeah. And by becoming more aware of these dynamics, we can kind of navigate our social landscape more effectively. We can understand why people act the way they do. Maybe even gain some insights into our own motivations and behaviors.
Yeah, it's like having a new set of tools to, like, decode the world around us.
Exactly, yeah. And who knows, maybe this deep dive will even inspire some self-reflection, like where do you see yourself within this framework and how does that awareness influence how you interact with others?
That's a good point. I mean, it's not just about analyzing figures from the past. It's about understanding ourselves and the roles we play.
Right.
But before we, go too far down that rabbit hole, let's come back to the SSH for a second. I mean, we've talked about its limitations, but are there any, like, specific weaknesses we should point out?
One of the biggest criticisms is that it can be overly simplistic.
Okay.
Trying to reduce human behavior to a set of categories, even ones that are kind of nuanced like these, it risks ignoring the unique complexities of each individual. You have to remember it's just a model.
Right.
It's a tool. It's a framework. It's not a definitive blueprint for how people interact.
Right. It's easy to fall into that trap of thinking, like, oh, this is how it is, period, end of story. But it's not that simple.
Yeah, and another criticism is that it can be kind of rigid, especially in how it describes the different types. And while those descriptions can be helpful starting points, they don't really account for how fluid personality can be, how much people can change and adapt over time.
That makes me think about the apostles, how they were kind of initially categorized as deltas, But then after Pentecost, they, undergo this huge transformation. They become so much bolder. They take on these leadership roles.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how, even though the SSH offers some really interesting observations, it can sometimes miss that dynamic nature of, how people grow and change.
So it's a useful tool, but we've got to use it carefully.
Yeah.
Remembering it's just one part of the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about taking the best of what the model offers and using it to, spark critical thinking and self-awareness, but not letting it, dictate how we understand ourselves or other people.
Well said. So as we kind of surface from this deep dive into the SSH and how it can be applied to biblical figures, what are the key takeaways? What should our listeners remember?
Well, we started off by kind of breaking down that SSH model, right, with all its different categories.
Right, from the alpha
The alpha, the beta, the delta,
to the omega and the
gamma.
enigmatic
Yeah.
sigma.
Yeah, the sigma operating outside the system, yeah.
And then we jumped into this whole question following Stanislas Berton about could Jesus be classified as an alpha male?
Yeah, we looked at Burton's reasoning. We talked about Jesus's leadership style, his charisma, his even his habit of giving nicknames.
Yeah, comparing that to, how alphas kind of typically behave. We even explored that pretty bold comparison that Burton made between Jesus giving nicknames and Donald Trump doing the same thing.
Right.
But then we also acknowledged, that to label Jesus as any single archetype, even alpha, I mean, it really oversimplifies, the complexities of who he was.
Yeah, we considered how Jesus's emphasis on compassion and humility and serving others, that might challenge that more traditional view of an alpha.
Right, yeah.
We talked about different perspectives, recognized that no model can perfectly capture all the little, ins and outs of human behavior.
And we kind of looked at some of the potential weaknesses of the SSH model itself,
Yeah.
recognizing that it can, oversimplify things. It can be a little rigid.
Right.
And while it can be helpful for observing those social dynamics, it's important to use it carefully.
And with critical thinking.
With critical thinking, yeah. So ultimately, this wasn't about just, putting a label on Jesus or anybody.
Right.
It was about using this framework as a way to kind of understand leadership better, power dynamics.
And how we interact with the world.
And how we interact with the world. So as we wrap things up, here's a final thought-provoking question for you, our listeners.
Ooh, love it. Hit us with it.
If you were to apply the SSH model to your own life, where would you fit in?
And how might that knowledge, knowing your own tendencies and the social dynamics at play, how might that change how you approach relationships, your work, even how you think about history and literature?
That's a great point.
Yeah, it's a journey of self-discovery, and we hope you, kind of take that on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and a big thanks to you for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep. 71